You're nothing but furniture in this house, expensive, useless furniture." Richard Whitmore spat the words directly into his wife's voices, then turned his back on her and walked across the ballroom floor toward his mistress. He reached into his jacket, he opened the velvet box, and while 500 people watched in absolute silence, he clasped a 15 million yen diamond necklace around Victoria Laurent's throat slowly, deliberately, making certain his wife could see every single second of it. Claire Whitmore stood motionless, champagne in hand. No tears, no trembling. Just that smile, quiet, certain, and more terrifying than anything Richard had ever faced in his life. If you're new here, subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The Hamilton Foundation Charity Gala was the kind of event that made ordinary people feel invisible and made powerful people feel invincible. Every year, the ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Midtown Manhattan transformed into something almost obscenely beautiful crystal chandeliers, throwing fractured light across 500 faces, each one belonging to someone who mattered in the world of money, influence, or carefully cultivated celebrity. Politicians sat next to hedge fund managers. Hollywood names shared tables with international investors. Charity in this world was never purely charitable. It was performance, it was positioning. It was the annual ritual where New York's wealthiest citizens reminded each other and themselves of exactly how far they had climbed. Richard Whitmore had organized this gala for 11 consecutive years. He was its host, its benefactor, its center of gravity. At 53, he was still physically commanding, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, the kind of man who filled a room simply by entering it. He wore confidence the way other men wore cologne, excessively and with absolute certainty that everyone around him appreciated it. And tonight, Richard Whitmore had something very specific planned. He had been planning it for 3 months. He told himself it was spontaneous. He told himself it was romantic. He told himself it was the kind of grand gesture that separated real men from timid ones. But the truth was simpler and uglier than any of the stories he told himself. The truth was that Richard Whitmore had spent the last 2 years conducting an affair with Victoria Laurent, and something inside him, something reckless and self-destructive and drunk on its own reflection, had decided that hiding was finished. Tonight he was going to make a statement. Victoria Laurent was 29 years old, and she was standing near the east end of the bar wearing a gown the color of deep water. Her dark hair pinned back in a way that made her look effortless and devastating at the same time. She had come into Richard's orbit 18 months earlier, as a consultant for the Foundation's rebranding initiative, and within 6 months she had become something else entirely: his executive director, his confidant, the person he called at 11 o'clock at night when his wife was already asleep, the person who laughed at every joke he made, who never pushed back on any decision, who looked at him as if he were the most extraordinary man she had ever encountered. Richard Whitmore had never been good at distinguishing between a woman who believed in him and a woman who understood how to make him believe in himself. Victoria understood the difference perfectly. She saw him coming across the ballroom, and the expression on her face shifted into something warm and inviting, and Richard felt that same rush he always felt around her, the particular electricity of being wanted by someone young and beautiful, and apparently uncomplicated. "You're early," she said softly. "I'm exactly on time," he said. "I'm always exactly on time," she smiled. "Of course you are." He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the weight of the velvet box, and everything inside him said, "Do this, this is yours, this is who you are now." And he did not hesitate. Richard Whitmore had built an empire by never hesitating. He had convinced himself that hesitation was weakness, that uncertainty was failure in its early stages, that the men who paused were the men who lost. So he did not pause. He took out the box, he opened it. The 15 million diamond necklace caught the light the way only obscene amounts of money cannot, subtly, not tastefully, but with a kind of aggressive magnificence that demanded acknowledgement. 12 carats of D-color, flawless stones set in platinum, the centerpiece a pear-shaped diamond that had once belonged to a Belgian royal family. Richard had acquired it through a private auction 3 weeks earlier, and he had paid for it the way men like him paid for things they wanted badly, quickly, completely, and without looking too carefully at the paperwork. "Richard," Victoria whispered, and her voice had dropped to something hushed and stunned. "What is that?" "It belongs on you," he said, and he stepped behind her and lifted the necklace from the box and placed it around her throat. The room noticed. Of course the room noticed. The ballroom was full of people who made careers out of noticing things. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence, champagne glasses lowered slowly from lips. Someone near the bar stopped talking entirely and simply stared. Within 30 seconds, an invisible current of awareness had moved through the 500 people in that room, and everyone understood what they were seeing, even if they couldn't yet articulate why it felt so wrong. What they were seeing was a married man publicly adorning his mistress with a diamond necklace worth more than most of them had paid for their first homes. And 3 feet away, standing perfectly still, was his wife. Claire Whitmore was 44 years old, and she was wearing a black dress that had cost perhaps $800, understated by the standards of this room, simple in a way that could have read as either careless or deliberate, depending on how closely you were paying attention. She wore no jewelry. She had worn no jewelry deliberately, though no one would understand why until much later. Her dark hair fell just past her shoulders, and she was holding a glass of champagne that she had not touched in the last 20 minutes. And when Richard clasped the diamonds around Victoria Laurent's throat, Claire Whitmore looked directly at her husband. She looked at him for exactly 4 seconds, and then she smiled. Not a smile that said she was fine, not a performative smile designed to mask humiliation. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things, a smile that contained something close to relief, or recognition, or perhaps the specific expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular moment and has just watched it finally arrive. Eleanor Voss, a board member of the Hamilton Foundation and one of the sharpest observers in any room she entered, was standing 12 feet from Claire when it happened. She would describe the moment weeks later to a close friend in precise terms. "I have watched a lot of people receive devastating news in public," Eleanor said. "I have seen people crumble and people perform and people do everything in between. But what Claire Whitmore did was different. She looked at Richard and she smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had just been proven exactly right about something they'd known for a very long time. It was not the smile of a victim. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting." The woman standing next to Claire, her closest friend, Diane Marsh, a Philadelphia-based attorney who had driven 4 hours specifically to attend this gala, reached out and touched Claire's arm. "Are you okay?" Diane said very quietly. "Perfectly," Claire said. Diane looked at Richard. She looked at Victoria. She looked at the diamond necklace glittering obscenely beneath the chandelier light. Then she looked back at Claire. "Should we leave?" "Absolutely not," Claire said, and she finally lifted her champagne glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I worked too hard on the centerpieces to leave before dessert." And Diane Marsh, who had known Claire Bennett before she became Claire Whitmore, who had sat beside her through law school exams and watched her argue her first federal case, and stood beside her at her wedding 12 years earlier, felt something in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. Something between admiration and foreboding. Because she knew, in the way that people who truly know kind things without being told, that Claire was not simply being brave. She was not performing composure. She was genuinely, completely unfractured. And that meant something was already in motion. What neither Diane nor anyone else in the ballroom knew, what Richard himself did not know, though he had technically signed the documents that proved it, was that Claire Whitmore had spent the previous 72 hours doing very specific things with very specific people. She had met with Marcus Webb, the managing partner of her family's private investment firm, at his office on the 44th floor of a building in Midtown, and they had reviewed documents for 3 hours. She had spoken with Patricia Chen, one of the country's most respected corporate attorneys, about the precise legal definition of misappropriation of restricted investment funds. She had requested, through proper channels and with complete authorization, a full accounting of the Restricted Acquisition Fund that Richard had set up 18 months earlier, the fund whose entire purpose was to capitalize the expansion of Whitmore Global into Southeast Asian markets. And she had learned, from a forensic accounting firm that her family's investment company retained, that $15 million from that restricted fund had been quietly transferred to a private account 6 weeks earlier and subsequently used for a private purchase at a Belgian auction house. A purchase of a diamond necklace, a necklace that was at this precise moment resting against the collarbone of Victoria Laurent while 500 people watched and pretended they weren't watching. Claire Whitmore knew what Richard had done before he did it publicly. She had known for 3 days, and she had spent those 3 days not crying, not confronting him, not calling lawyers in a panic, or confiding in friends while her hands shook. She had spent those 3 days being methodical, being precise, being exactly the person she had been trained to be before Richard Whitmore had ever appeared in her life. Because Claire Whitmore had not always been Mrs. Whitmore. Before the marriage, before the charity galas, before the Midtown penthouse and the Hampton house, and the car that arrived at 7 each morning, Claire Bennett had been something specific and formidable. She had graduated second in her class from Columbia Law School. She had spent 4 years as an associate at one of Boston's most demanding corporate firms, where she had developed a particular specialty in what her colleagues called corporate architecture, the complex structures of trusts, investment agreements, and shareholder arrangements that determined, at the fundamental level, who actually owned what and who actually controlled whom. She had been exceptionally good at it. She had met Richard Whitmore at a fundraising dinner in Boston when she was 32 and he was 41. He was charming in the way that genuinely successful men often are not performed charm, but the easy confidence of someone who has never needed to try too hard. He was funny, he was attentive, he asked questions and appeared to actually listen to the answers. He told her, on their 3rd date, that he had never met a woman who made him feel simultaneously outmatched and understood, and Claire had laughed at that because it was both flattering and slightly transparent, and she appreciated that he was smart enough to know the difference. They were married 14 months after that first meeting, and for the first 4 years the marriage was genuinely good. Richard valued her intelligence, he consulted her on business decisions. He introduced her to colleagues not as his wife but as his partner, and he meant it not as a performance of modern marriage but as an accurate description of how he actually saw her. She sat in on board meetings when she was invited and offered observations that people remembered afterward. She was not interested in the social performance of being Mrs. Richard Whitmore. She was interested in the actual work, and Richard, in those early years, found that quality in her both attractive and practically useful. Then the crisis came. 7 years into the marriage, Whitmore Global faced something that should have killed it. A combination of factors: a failed international acquisition, a regulatory change that devastated the shipping division, and a deeply ill-advised real estate development in Florida that cost the company $340 million when the market collapsed, had pushed the company to the edge of something catastrophic. Banks were reviewing covenant violations. 2 major investors had sent preliminary notices of their intention to withdraw. The board was holding emergency sessions. Richard Whitmore, who had never truly faced failure at this scale, was responding to the crisis in the worst possible way by insisting to everyone around him that it wasn't as serious as it appeared. Claire saw it differently. She sat at her husband's desk one night after he had finally gone to bed, and she read every document she could find. Balance sheets, loan agreements, investor letters, the details of the regulatory violation, the timeline of the real estate collapse. She read for 6 hours, and by the time the sun came up, she had a comprehensive understanding of exactly how broken the company was and exactly what would be required to save it. She called Marcus Webb that morning. Marcus Webb was not simply her family's investment partner. He was the executor of the Bennett Family Trust, a private investment structure that Claire's grandfather had established in the 1970s, and that had grown, through careful stewardship over 3 generations, into something substantial and deliberately quiet. The Bennett family had never been flashy with their money. They had simply been patient and consistent, and patience and consistency over 50 years had produced, in the language of finance, significant leverage. Marcus Webb was also one of the most discreet men Claire had ever known, which was the quality she most valued in him. "I need to rescue my husband's company," she told him. "I need it done in a way that is legal, structured, and invisible." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Invisible to whom?" he asked. "To everyone," she said, including Richard. The rescue took 4 months and required a level of precision that Claire found, if in her most private thoughts, genuinely satisfying in the way that complex problems solved cleanly are always satisfying. She arranged emergency bridge financing through a series of entities connected to the Bennett Trust, structured in such a way that the capital appeared to come from a conventional investment consortium rather than from his wife's family fortune. She renegotiated 2 of the most dangerous loan agreements, working through intermediaries, presenting terms that the banks found attractive enough to accept that would have removed Richard from operational control. She drafted a revised investor agreement, the same agreement that Richard had signed without reading carefully, the same agreement he would, one day, desperately wish he had read with the attention it deserved, that protected the company's governance structure, while quietly establishing specific conditions under which control could be transferred. Richard never knew. Or more precisely, Richard believed what he wanted to believe. When the crisis passed, when the banks stopped circling and the investors stayed and the company stabilized, and over the following 3 years, recovered and expanded and became more successful than it had ever been before, Richard attributed it to his own leadership, to his decisive action, to his vision and his instincts and his willingness to make hard choices under pressure. He thanked several people publicly. He gave bonuses. He made a speech at the next annual gala about resilience and determination and the power of believing in what you'd built. He did not mention Claire, and Claire did not expect him to. She had not saved his company because she expected credit. She had saved it because it was the right thing to do, and because she loved him, and because 4,000 employees depended on the company's survival, and because, if she was honest with herself, she was also protecting something she had helped build in ways Richard could not see or did not want to see. But there is a particular kind of quiet that fills the space between a person who has done something essential and the person who has failed to notice it. And that quiet, over the following years, slowly changed its character. It stopped being the comfortable silence of a couple that doesn't need to explain everything to each other. And it became something else, the silence of a man who had forgotten to look, and a woman who had begun, finally, to be tired of being invisible. Victoria Laurent appeared in that specific silence. Claire had known about the affair for 14 months before the gala. Not suspected, known, she had said nothing. She had made no confrontation, no ultimatum, no tearful 2 a.m. conversation. She had watched and waited the way she had been waiting her entire life, and while she watched, she learned something very specific about her husband's relationship with Victoria Laurent that went beyond the personal betrayal into something professionally significant. Richard had been restructuring resources to benefit Victoria. Not small amounts, not perks or favors that could be explained away. Actual company resources, actual restricted funds, actual violations of the fiduciary duties that Richard owed to the board, to the investors, and to every shareholder of Whitmore Global Holdings. It had started 18 months earlier with the executive director appointment, a position that carried a salary well above industry standard for someone with Victoria's experience level, charged to the foundation's operational budget. Then the apartment, a luxury residence on the Upper East Side, held by a shell company that was technically a subsidiary of one of the foundation's vendor relationships. Private flights billed as business travel. A wardrobe allowance buried in the foundation's executive development line. And finally, most recently, most recklessly, the $15 million transfer from the restricted exhibitionists to purchase a diamond necklace at a private auction. That last transaction was not clever. It was not hidden behind anything sophisticated. It was the act of a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable and had finally started behaving accordingly. Claire had every document. She had them organized, cross-referenced, and verified by forensic accountants who did not know whose company they were auditing until the work was complete and the findings were irreversible. She had sent everything to Marcus Webb 48 hours before the gala. And Marcus Webb had, 48 hours before the gala, forwarded the package to Patricia Chen with a cover letter that began, "Please review at your earliest convenience. Our client believes this may be the appropriate time to invoke Section 14 of the Whitmore Investor Agreement." Section 14. The clause that Claire had drafted 7 years ago during the rescue, and that Richard had signed without reading because he trusted the people around him, the way powerful men often trust people around them, with total confidence and almost no attention. Section 14 stated, in precise corporate legal language, that if the controlling officer of Whitmore Global Holdings was found to have misappropriated restricted capital or violated his fiduciary duties to the investment consortium, the consortium held the right to call an emergency board review and present findings directly to the full board without advance notice to the controlling officer. Without advance notice to Richard. Standing in the ballroom, watching her husband fasten diamonds around another woman's throat, Claire Whitmore was not broken. She was not humiliated. She was not even particularly least. She was a woman watching the final piece fall exactly into place. Diane Marsh had moved slightly closer to her, the way old friends do when they sense something seismic even without being told explicitly that the ground is about to shift. Around them, the murmuring had not died down, it had deepened, taken on a different quality, the kind of sustained whisper that meant the room was processing something and hadn't finished yet. Near the bar, two men in their 60s were no longer making any attempt to be discreet. One of them was Jackson Pryor, a hedge fund manager who had invested in Whitmore Global's third expansion fund, and he was looking at Richard with an expression that combined discomfort with the beginning of something sharper. "That's not the necklace from the acquisition fund budget," Jackson said to the man beside him. The man beside him, whose name was Franklin Holt, and who served on the foundation's advisory board, said nothing immediately. "It is," Jackson said, and his voice had gone quieter. "I recognize the piece from the auction catalog. I was bidding on it for my wife. It went to a private buyer at 15. Franklin Holt turned to look at him. "You're sure?" "I'm absolutely sure," Jackson said. "And I am going to be having a very specific conversation tomorrow morning." Neither man knew that their conversation was not necessary, that the conversation they were imagining having had already been initiated, through proper channels, by someone far better positioned to have it. Richard, meanwhile, was unaware of any of this. He was standing beside Victoria, receiving compliments from people who were actually trying to determine what they were witnessing, and he was interpreting their attention as admiration and their careful questions as interest. He had had 3 glasses of scotch, and he was feeling something he had not felt in a long time, reckless and large and entirely himself. He believed that the world was watching him be powerful. He was right that the world was watching. He was completely wrong about what the world was seeing. Claire finished her champagne and set the glass down on a passing tray and touched Diane's arm. "Walk with me for a moment," she said. They moved to a quieter section near the windows, away from the center of the room. "Tell me honestly," Diane said, "how are you actually doing?" "I'm well," Claire said. "Claire, I'm serious," Claire said. "I'm genuinely well." Diane studied her friend for a long moment. Diane Marsh had known Claire for 22 years. She knew the difference between Claire strength and Claire actually possessing it. She knew the specific quality of Claire's composure, when it was real, a certain settled stillness, a quality of attention that was focused rather than braced. This was real. "What have you done?" Diane said very quietly. Claire looked out at the ballroom, at her husband placing his hand on the small of Victoria Laurent's back, at the glittering necklace, at the 500 people who were watching and absorbing and cataloging this moment. "I've done what I was trained to do," Claire said. "Which is, read the documents before I sign anything," Claire said. "And make sure the right people have read the documents too." Diane was quiet. "Marcus," she finally said. "Marcus," Claire confirmed. Another silence. "When?" Diane asked. "Tomorrow morning," Claire said. "The board has been notified of an emergency review." Diane absorbed this. "And Richard?" "Richard," Claire said carefully, "will be the last person in the building to understand what's happening. Which is exactly how he's operated for the last 7 years. She said it without anger, without satisfaction even. It was simply an observation, the dispassionate accuracy of someone describing a structural fact. "I'm going to get another glass of champagne," Claire said. "And I'm going to enjoy the rest of this gala because I spent 3 weeks overseeing the floral arrangements and the string quartet is genuinely excellent. Come with me." She walked back toward the center of the room. And Diane Marsh, watching her go, felt the distinct and certain sensation of standing at the edge of something very large that was just beginning to move. Richard crossed paths with Claire, briefly near the end of the evening. He was moving toward the exit, Victoria's coat over his arm, and he nearly walked past his wife before some combination of social awareness and residual conscience made him stop. "You look lovely tonight," he said. It was such an insufficient thing to say in the wake of what he had done that Claire would have found it almost funny, if funny were the feeling she was reaching for. Instead, she looked at him with the same quality of attention she had been carrying all evening, not cold, not hostile, simply exact. "You should get some rest," she said. "You have a board meeting tomorrow that will require your full attention." Richard frowned. "Tomorrow? I don't have anything scheduled tomorrow." "You will by morning," she said, and she walked away before he could ask what she meant. He watched her go. And for a single moment, something moved through him that he couldn't quite identify, a brief awareness, sharp and uncomfortable, that he had perhaps misunderstood something essential. That the woman walking away from him was not the woman he had imagined her to be for the last 7 years. That the certainty he had built around himself about who held power and who didn't, about who had something to lose and who didn't, had perhaps been constructed on a foundation he had never actually examined. But the moment passed. He told himself he was overthinking it. He told himself it was just Claire being Claire-controlled, cryptic, impossible to read. He followed Victoria through the exit, and the night closed behind him, carrying with it the last hours during which Richard Whitmore would move through the world as the man he believed himself to be. In the elevator up to their penthouse, Claire stood alone and looked at her reflection in the polished metal doors. She thought about the woman she had been 12 years ago, the attorney who had believed that love was stronger than transaction, that loyalty was its own reward, that a marriage was a different kind of partnership than a business arrangement and should be treated accordingly. She thought about the 4,000 people who worked for Whitmore Global and who deserved to have their livelihoods protected from a man who had started to believe that the company existed to serve his appetites rather than the other way around. She thought about the agreement she had drafted, the clauses she had written, the structure she had built not as a trap, she told herself, never as a trap, as a protection, as a net beneath the high wire that everyone was walking. If Richard had simply been faithful, if he had simply been a decent person, none of this would have been activated. The elevator reached the penthouse floor. Claire stepped out. She went to her study, sat at her desk, and sent 3 messages. One to Marcus Webb confirming the morning schedule. One to Patricia Chen confirming her readiness. One to Eleanor Voss, who was on the foundation board and who had watched the evening with the same careful attention Claire had come to depend on. Eleanor's reply came within 2 minutes. I saw everything. I'm ready. Tell me what you need. Claire turned off the light. She slept soundly. In another part of the city, in a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side that appeared on company records as an operational expense, Richard Whitmore lay awake in the early hours of the morning with the specific restlessness of a man who has done something irreversible and is just beginning to sense, without yet understanding, that the consequences have already been set in motion. He did not sleep well. And somewhere in the architecture of the city, in the network of agreements and trusts and legal structures that Claire Whitmore had spent years quietly building into the foundations of her husband's empire, everything was perfectly in order. Every document in its file, every clause in its place, every piece positioned exactly where she had put it, years before she knew she would need it, or perhaps, if she was honest, because she had always known she might. The morning was coming. And with it, the board meeting that Richard Whitmore had not scheduled, had not anticipated, and was entirely unprepared to survive. The morning after the gala, Richard Whitmore woke up at 7:43, feeling the particular clarity that comes from having finally done something you've been building toward for a long time. He lay in the bed of Victoria's Upper East Side apartment and stared at the ceiling and told himself that last night had been necessary, that it had been honest, that a man of his position deserved to live openly, without apology, without the constant performance of a marriage that had quietly become a business arrangement wearing the costume of a partnership. He was very good at telling himself things. He showered, dressed in the spare clothes he kept in Victoria's closet, and checked his phone. 47 messages. That was not unusual after a major public event. What was unusual was the sender distribution. Normally, the morning after the gala brought congratulatory notes, press inquiries, thank you messages from foundation donors. This morning, 11 of the 47 messages were from board members. 3 were from the company's general counsel. 2 were from Jackson Pryor, whose name alone sent a specific chill through Richard's chest that he immediately decided to attribute to the cold air in the apartment rather than to anything that should concern him. He opened Jackson's first message. Richard, call me immediately. This is not optional. He opened the second. I mean it. Call me before you go anywhere. Richard set the phone face down on the counter and poured himself a coffee and stood there for a moment, and for the second time in 12 hours he felt that uncomfortable flicker, that brief, unwelcome awareness that something was moving in a direction he had not authorized. He picked the phone back up. He called his assistant. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. I was just about to call you. There's been a board meeting request filed this morning under emergency review protocol. The notice was sent at 6:15 a.m. Richard went very still. Who filed it? His assistant hesitated in the particular way that people hesitate when they have information that will not be well received. The request was filed by the Bennett Family Investment Trust through their managing partner, Marcus Webb. Mr. Webb cited Section 14 of the primary investor agreement. The coffee cup in Richard's hand was suddenly very heavy. Section 14, he repeated. Yes, sir. He had not thought about Section 14 in 7 years. He had not thought about it because he had not read it carefully when he signed it. And what a man doesn't read carefully, he tends not to carry forward in his memory with any precision. He knew it involved some provision about board review. He knew it had something to do with investor protections from the rescue period. He had assumed, in the vague way that powerful men assume things they find inconvenient, that it was standard boilerplate language inserted by lawyers doing their jobs, and never actually intended to be used. What time is the meeting, he said. 10 o'clock, sir. The board has confirmed attendance. All 12 members. It was 7:51. He had 2 hours and 9 minutes. Get me Howard Greer, Richard said, naming his personal attorney, and get me a car, and call the office and tell them I'm coming in directly. He hung up and looked at Victoria, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway in a silk robe, holding her own coffee, watching him with an expression that was trying to be calm and not entirely succeeding. What's happening, she said. Nothing I can't handle, Richard said. It was an automatic answer, the verbal equivalent of a reflex. He had been saying it for 20 years. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Your wife, she said quietly. This is her, isn't it? It was not a question. Richard picked up his jacket. I'll call you later, Richard. Her voice had changed. The warmth that was always in it when she spoke to him had been replaced by something more careful. Be honest with me for a second. What is she capable of? He paused at the door. She's capable of making things difficult, he said. She's done it before when she doesn't get what she wants. He said it with complete confidence. He was wrong about nearly every word of it, but he said it with complete confidence. And that confidence was the armor he wore as he walked out the door and into the elevator and into the car that was waiting at the curb. He wore it the entire drive to the office, fielding calls from Howard Greer and from his CSO and from 2 board members who were careful with their language, but whose caution itself told him more than their words did. He wore it through the lobby and into the executive elevator. He stopped wearing it the moment he walked into the 40th floor conference room and saw who was already seated at the table. Claire was there. Not standing near the window, not sitting quietly at the side. She was seated at the table itself, on the opposite side from where Richard customarily sat, and beside her were 2 people he recognized immediately and had not expected to see in this room. Patricia Chen, one of the most respected corporate attorneys in New York, and Marcus Webb, who had managed the Bennett Family Trust for 30 years and who Richard had met precisely 4 times in his life, all 4 times during the crisis period 7 years ago. The 12 board members were already seated. Eleanor Voss was among them, and when Richard made eye contact with her, she held his gaze for exactly look away, and that single second told him that Eleanor Voss was not his ally in this room. Richard walked to his chair. He sat down. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him with the same quality of attention he had seen last night in the ballroom, that settled, complete, unhurried focus that he had spent years misreading as passivity. Claire, he said, and his voice carried the particular tone of a man asserting authority he isn't certain he possesses. Whatever you think you're doing here, I want you to understand that this is not the appropriate venue for personal matters. I agree completely, Claire said, which is why I'm not here for personal matters. She opened the folder in front of her and placed 3 documents at the center of the table. I'm here because 18 months of financial records indicate that the CEO of this company has been misappropriating restricted capital, and the investment consortium that holds a controlling interest in those funds has invoked their right to present findings to the full board under Section 14 of the primary investor agreement. The room was completely silent. Richard looked at the documents. He looked at Marcus Webb. He looked at Patricia Chen, who was watching him with the professional composure of someone who has been in many rooms like this one and has never once been the most uncomfortable person in it. This is personal, Richard said. She's doing this because of what happened last night. Everyone in this room knows that. Eleanor Voss spoke for the first time. Richard, she said, and her voice was careful and even. I watched what happened last night. We all have opinions about it. But what I'm looking at right now is a document showing $15 million a transfer from the South Asia Acquisition Fund to a private account registered to a holding company that on examination has no operational purpose. She paused. I'd like you to explain that transfer. Richard felt the temperature in his chest drop by several degrees. That was temporary, he said. I moved funds to address a short-term liquidity issue with a personal investment. It was going to be replaced when, Patricia Chen said. Just that. Just the single word, delivered with the quiet precision of someone who asks questions they already know the answers to. Richard looked at her. Within the quarter, the transfer was made 8 weeks ago, Patricia said. The acquisition window for the Southeast Asian market closes in 11 days. The fund is $15 million short of its required capitalization threshold. If the threshold is not met, the consortium loses the option and the company forfeits the $4 million earnest payment already committed. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I'd like to understand which part of this was temporary. Richard opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned to Howard Greer, who was seated slightly behind him and to the right, and the expression on Howard's face was the expression of a man who has just realized that he did not have enough information coming into this meeting, and that this deficit is now his problem as much as anyone's. I'll need a moment with my client, Howard said. Of course, Patricia said, though I should note that the consortium's findings have already been submitted to the board under Section 14, and the board's review obligation is independent of whatever conversation you have with your client. The process moves forward regardless. Richard leaned toward Howard and kept his voice low, but not low enough, because the conference table was not as wide as he needed it to be in that moment. How bad is this, he said. Howard's response was equally quiet. Potentially very bad. If Section 14 is what it appears to be, the board has an obligation to review and vote. If the vote goes against you, it won't, Richard said. Howard looked at the 12 faces around the table. Richard, he said quietly, when did you last speak individually with each of these board members? The question landed badly, because the honest answer was that Richard hadn't spoken individually with most of his board members in months. He had been occupied. He had been busy. He had the company running smoothly, or believed he did, and board management had felt less urgent than other priorities. Victoria had been a priority. The gala had been a priority. The Belgian auction had been a priority. The board had not been a priority. And now 12 people were sitting in a room with documents he had never expected to see, assembled this precisely, prepared by people he had never thought to account for, filed by a trust he had stopped thinking about 7 years ago because it had been useful, and then become invisible the way things becomes invisible when you stop needing to look at them. Claire had not stopped looking at it. She had been looking at it the entire time. Marcus Webb spoke for the first time since Richard had entered the room. His voice was unhurried and carried the particular weight of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now simply reporting facts. 7 years ago, Marcus said, the Bennett Family Trust committed emergency capital to stabilize Whitmore Global Holdings through a structured rescue agreement. That agreement contained specific provisions regarding governance, fiduciary responsibility, and investor protections. Among those provisions was Section 14, which grants the consortium the right to call an emergency board review upon documented evidence of capital misappropriation. He looked at Richard directly. We documented the evidence. We filed the review. We are here. Richard looked at his wife. You did this, he said. You went behind my back and you built a case against me because you're angry. Because of last night, Claire did not flinch. Last night, she said evenly, you used $15 million of restricted company funds to purchase a piece of jewelry for a private purpose. That is a fact. It is documented. It is not a question of our marriage. It is a question of your fiduciary duty to this company and to everyone who depends on it. You're doing this to hurt me, Richard. Her voice remained completely level. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have done this 14 months ago. The room absorbed that. 14 months. The number registered on several faces around the table, the slight shift, the recalibration, the understanding that Claire Whitmore had known about something for 14 months and had waited, and the question of what exactly she had been waiting for and why was now moving quietly through every person in that room. Jackson Pryor, who had been silent since the meeting began, leaned forward. I want to understand the timeline, he said. You're saying she knew about the financial issues for 14 months? She knew about the affair for 14 months, Eleanor Voss said quietly. The financial documentation appears to cover the last 18 months of transactions. Jackson looked at Claire. When did you engage the forensic accounting team? 6 weeks ago, Claire said, when the acquisition fund transfer was made. So you weren't building a case, Jackson said slowly. You were watching, and when he crossed a line that endangered the company, you acted. Correct, Claire said. Jackson sat back in his chair and said nothing further, but his expression had shifted into something that was not sympathy for Richard. Howard Greer called for a recess. Richard stood in the hallway with his attorney, and for the first time that morning allowed himself to feel the specific weight of what was happening, not the performance of confidence, not the reflexive assertion of control, but the actual physical sensation of standing in a place from which there was no good exit. "Walk me through Section 14, he said to Howard. "All of it." Howard pulled up the agreement on his tablet and read in silence for 90 seconds. When he looked up, something in his expression had resolved into the particular seriousness of a man who has finished hoping. "Section 14 gives the consortium the right to call the review and to present findings," Howard said. "The board then votes. A 2/3 majority can authorize a governance restructuring, which includes removal of the controlling officer." "Removal," Richard repeated. "Yes, they can remove me from my own company. From the CEO position, yes, your equity stake is separate. But operational control, it's my company," Richard said, and his voice had dropped into something that was no longer performing anything. "I built it." Howard looked at him with the careful honesty of a man who has represented enough powerful clients to know when honesty is the only thing left that serves anyone. "Richard," he said, "did you read this agreement before you signed it?" A long pause. "My lawyers reviewed it at the time." "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was the answer. They went back into the room. Richard sat down and looked at his wife and tried one more time to find the version of this situation that was recoverable on his terms. "Claire," he said, and he dropped his voice to something that was meant to be private, but was audible to everyone within 10 feet. "Whatever you want. Name it. This doesn't have to happen this way." Claire looked at him. 4,000 people work for this company," she said. "They have mortgages, children, medical insurance tied to their employment. You moved $15 million from a fund that was supposed to protect their jobs to buy jewelry." She paused. "This isn't about what I want, Richard. This is about what this company needs. And what it needs is a board that does its job." She turned to face the table. "I'd like to continue." The presentation that Marcus Webb and Patricia Chen delivered over the following 40 minutes was precise, comprehensive, and devastating in the specific way that well-organized truth is always devastating when it meets a person who has been operating on the assumption that the truth will never be this organized. Every transaction, every transfer, every misdirected expense, the apartment, the travel, the wardrobe allowance, the necklace, each item documented, cross-referenced, and presented in the calm, methodical language of people who have done their homework completely. Richard made 3 attempts to interrupt and was each time quietly redirected by Patricia Chen, who managed the room with the particular authority of someone who has prepared for every possible version of this conversation. At one point, Richard turned to the board member to his immediate left, a man named Gerald Sutton, who had been on the board for 9 years and who Richard had always considered an ally. "Gerald," Richard said, "come on, you know me." Gerald Sutton looked at him. "I do know you," Gerald said. "That's why I'm listening very carefully." When the presentation concluded, Eleanor Voss called for the vote. Richard stood up. "I want to address the board directly before any vote," he said. No one objected. He had that right, and everyone knew it. He stood at the end of the table, and he looked at the 12 faces that had been in this company's orbit. For years, people he had hired, people he had promoted, people he had brought to dinners and sent holiday gifts to, and sat beside at industry events and believed until this morning were fundamentally in his corner. "I built this company," he said. "I built it from a single real estate investment into what it is today. 12 years ago, when no one believed in the vision I believed. Every expansion, every acquisition, every risk that paid off, that was my judgment. My instincts, I made this company what it is." He looked around the table. "One financial decision that I fully intended to correct does not erase that history." He stopped, he waited. Eleanor Voss said quietly, "Are you finished?" "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said, and then to the table, all in favor of initiating governance restructuring under Section 14. 9 hands went up, then a 10th, then an 11th. Richard counted them without moving, 11 out of 12. 11 people who had attended his galas and shaken his hand and said his name with a particular respect that he had believed was permanent and had turned out to be conditional. He looked at Claire. She was not watching the hands. She was watching him, and her expression was not triumphant, not satisfied, not cold. It was something closer to sad, the specific sadness of a person who has done what was necessary and finds no pleasure in the result. That expression reached him in a way that the 11 hands had not. "Claire," he said. "Sit down, Richard," she said quietly. He sat down. The chairman of the board, a man named Arthur Bellamy, who had said almost nothing during the entire proceeding, spoke for the first time with the formal gravity of someone discharging an obligation he would rather not have. The board has voted. Under Section 14 of the Primary Investor Agreement, governance restructuring is authorized. Richard Whitmore is relieved of his duties as Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Global Holdings, effective immediately. An interim CEO will be appointed by end of business today. The restructuring committee will convene tomorrow morning. Richard heard the words. He heard them the way a man hears news that his mind refuses to fully process in real time, each word individually comprehensible, the sum of them somehow still impossible. Arthur continued. All access credentials, executive authority are suspended pending completion of the restructuring review. Howard, I'd ask that you work with our general counsel to ensure a smooth transition. Howard nodded. He did not look at Richard. The meeting was over. People began moving, gathering papers, pushing back chairs, the particular organized dispersal of a room that has accomplished something and is now moving to the next necessary thing. Nobody moved toward Richard. Nobody came to stand beside him or offer a word or touch his shoulder. The social gravity of the room had shifted completely in the course of 90 minutes, and Richard Whitmore, who had spent decades being the center of every room he entered, was now simply a man in a chair while the room moved around him and away. Marcus Webb paused near the door and looked back at Richard with an expression that was entirely without cruelty and contained something that might, in a different context, have been mistaken for pity. Then he followed Claire out of the room. Richard sat alone at the table. Howard Greer came back in after a moment, carrying his briefcase, and sat down across from his client. I need you to listen to me carefully, Howard said, because what happens in the next 48 hours matters enormously. Richard looked at him. His eyes had the quality of a man who is still trying to find the angle, still searching for the move that recovers the situation, still refusing at some level to accept that there is no such move. Is there a way to fight this? Richard said. Howard was quiet for a moment. You signed Section 14, he said. You moved the money. The documentation is complete and verified. The board voted 11-1. He paused. I will do everything I am able to do for you, Richard. But I need you to understand the actual landscape. Tell me the landscape. The landscape, Howard said slowly, is that Claire Whitmore drafted the agreement that removed you. She drafted it 7 years ago when she saved your company, and she placed in it a specific mechanism that she knew, eventually, she might need. And then she waited for you to give her a reason to use it. He paused. The landscape is that she was not acting out of anger or revenge. She was acting out of preparation, and preparation in a courtroom or a boardroom beats anger every single time. Richard said nothing. I've been your attorney for 16 years, Howard said, and I'm going to tell you something as your attorney and also as someone who has known you for a long time. The person who actually saved your company from collapse 7 years ago, the person who built the structure that kept 4,000 people employed was your wife. And you didn't know it, or you knew it somewhere and chose not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have required you to understand something about the nature of what she had done for you and what that meant about who she was. He put his briefcase on the table. And instead of looking at it, you put diamonds on someone else. It was the longest speech Howard Greer had made to a client in 30 years of practice. Richard sat with it for a long time. The room was completely quiet. Outside the windows 40 floors below, the city moved with its ordinary indifference, the cars and the people, and the noise of a Tuesday morning that had no awareness of and no particular interest in the fact that a man was sitting in a room above it, understanding, for the first time, the full dimensions of what he had lost. Not the company, not the title, not the stock options or the corner office or the access credentials currently being suspended by the IT department 12 floors down. What he had lost was the understanding of who Claire actually was. And what was worse, the specific, unforgiving thing that lived at the center of it was that he had been given every opportunity to see her clearly and had chosen, each time the opportunity arose, to look somewhere else. He thought about the night she had stayed up reading his company's financial documents while he slept. He thought about the 4 months she had spent in perfect silence, rebuilding something he had nearly destroyed. He thought about the agreement he had signed without reading, and the woman who had written it, and the specific kind of intelligence required to write a protective clause and then live inside the marriage for 7 years, faithfully and patiently, waiting for the day it might never need to be used. She had hoped it would never need to be used. He understood that now. He had made it necessary. Howard stood up. "I'll be in touch this afternoon," he said. "Don't speak to the press, don't speak to the board. Don't call anyone who was in that room today." He left. Richard sat alone in the conference room of his own company for another 15 minutes. Then security came politely, professionally. 2 men he recognized from the building, staff who looked uncomfortable and said nothing beyond what was required, and he understood that the 15 minutes were over. He walked to the elevator, he pressed the lobby button. He rode down 40 floors in the same elevator he had ridden up every morning for 11 years. And when the doors opened onto the lobby, the doorman looked at him and nodded the way. Doorman nodded at people leaving, not the particular acknowledgement reserved for the man who owned the building, but the general acknowledgement given to anyone passing through. Richard walked out onto the street. The city received him with complete indifference. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and then, because there was nothing else to do, he started walking. And somewhere across the city, in a conference room at the offices of the Bennett Family Trust, Claire Whitmore was sitting with Marcus Webb and Patricia Chen and Eleanor Voss, and they were talking about the restructuring committee and the interim CEO candidates and the Southeast Asia acquisition timeline, and the press statement that would go out before close of business. And Claire was listening carefully and asking precise questions and working through the next necessary thing with the same steady, focused attention she had brought to every problem she had ever encountered in her life. She did not look like a woman who had just watched her marriage end. She looked like someone doing her job, because that was finally and completely exactly what she was doing. The press statement went out at 4:57 p.m., 13 minutes before the close of business, and within 20 minutes it had been picked up by every major financial news outlet in the country. The statement was clean, precise, and entirely devastating in the way that corporate language can be devastating when it is deployed by people who understand exactly what they are doing. It did not use inflammatory words, it did not editorialize. It simply stated that the board of Whitmore Global Holdings had convened an emergency governance review under the terms of the primary investor agreement, that the review had resulted in a board vote authorizing restructuring, and that Richard Whitmore had been relieved of his duties as chief executive officer effective immediately. An interim CEO would be announced within 48 hours. The company remained fully operational. All commitments to employees, partners, and investors remained intact. That last sentence was Claire's specific addition. She had insisted on it. Because 4,000 people had woken up that morning with jobs and health insurance and mortgages calibrated against a salary they expected to continue, and they deserved to know, before they went to bed, that the crisis was not theirs. By 6 o'clock, Richard's phone had received 214 calls and messages. He answered none of them. He was sitting in the study of the Whitmore penthouse, the apartment that was technically still his residence, that his name was still on, that he had returned to because he had nowhere else that made sense to go, and he was reading the press coverage with the specific numbness of a man who is watching his own life be described by people who were not present for any of it and are nonetheless getting most of it right. The financial press was focused on the governance angle, the acquisition fund, the 11-to-1 vote, the unusual invocation of Section 14 by a private family trust whose connection to Whitmore Global had not been publicly known. Several outlets were already working on the story of the rescue. The 4-month stabilization period 7 years ago, that is, had saved the company, the structure of the Bennett Family Trust, the identity of the woman who had apparently engineered both the rescue and the removal of the same man. The social press was focused on the gala. The gala coverage was worse. 3 separate photographers had captured the moment with the necklace from different angles, and the images had been circulating since midnight the previous evening. They showed Richard's hands at Victoria's throat, the diamonds catching the light, the hundred faces in the background turned toward the spectacle. And in 2 of the 3 photographs, visible at the edge of the frame, was Claire, champagne glass in hand, black dress, no jewelry. That expression. The expression that everyone was now trying to describe. One outlet called it eerie composure, another said icy dignity. A third, written by a woman who had clearly looked at the photograph for a long time, said simply, "She already knew." Richard put his phone face down on the desk. He sat in the silence of the apartment that had once been full of people, dinner parties, strategy sessions, early mornings with coffee and newspapers, and the comfortable noise of a life that was being built, and the silence now was a different kind entirely. It was the silence of subtraction. the silence of a room from which something essential has been removed and has not yet been replaced by anything. He heard the door. Claire came in at 7:15, and she moved through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone who has a list of things to accomplish and intends to accomplish them without drama. She went directly to her study. Richard heard her on the phone brief, professional, the specific cadence of someone wrapping up the day's business. Then silence, then the sound of her moving toward the kitchen. He got up. He found her standing at the kitchen counter, pouring water, still in the clothes she had worn to the board meeting. She looked tired in the way that competent people look tired after a day of sustained, precise effort, not depleted, but settled into a kind of earned quietness. She looked up when he came in. "I didn't expect you to be here," she said. "Where else would I go?" he said. She didn't answer that. She drank her water and set the glass down and looked at him with the same quality of attention she had been directing at him for 24 hours. Not hostile, not warm, simply accurate. "I want to understand something," Richard said. "All right. 7 years ago, the rescue, the funding, the agreement." He paused. "Did you know then? Did you build Section 14 because you already knew this was coming?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I built Section 14 because I was a corporate attorney who had spent 10 years building governance structures, and I was not going to commit my family's capital to saving a company without installing appropriate protections." "That's not prophecy, Richard. That's professional competence." She paused. "I hoped I would never need to use it. For 7 years, I hoped. But you were watching." "I was always watching," she said. "That's who I am. You just stopped noticing." He leaned against the counter. He had 100 things he wanted to say, and none of them were adequate to the size of what he needed to say. And standing in his kitchen at 7:30 in the evening, after the worst day of his professional life, he found that the gap between what he felt and what he could articulate was wider than any gap he had ever encountered. "I'm sorry," he said. Claire looked at him. "I know," she said. "But Richard and I want you to hear this clearly. Your apology belongs to this marriage. What happened today at the board meeting was not about the marriage. It was about the company. Those are two separate things, and I need you to understand that, because if you spend the next several months believing that I removed you from your company as a form of revenge for the affair, you will have understood nothing." "Then help me understand," he said. "You moved $15 million from a restricted fund," she said. "Money that 4,000 people depended on. You moved it to buy a necklace. That is not a marital transgression, Richard. That is a fiduciary violation. And when someone commits a fiduciary violation that threatens the livelihoods of 4,000 people, the appropriate response is not to have a private conversation about feelings. The appropriate response is exactly what happened today." He was quiet for a long moment. "You could have come to me first," he said. "You could have told me what you knew and given me a chance to fix it. You shoved me in front of 500 people and put diamonds on another woman," Claire said. "We had moved somewhat past the stage where I was coming to you first." It landed exactly as hard as the truth always lands when it is stated without embellishment. Richard said nothing. "I'm going to sleep," Claire said. "We have a great deal to sort out in the coming weeks, and we will need to be functional adults while we do it. I'd recommend you get some rest." She walked out of the kitchen. Richard stayed where he was for a long time, 2 floors below the penthouse in the building's lobby. A man named Derek Walsh, a reporter for the Financial Chronicle, who had covered Whitmore Global for 6 years, was having a conversation with the doorman that the doorman was declining to participate in beyond the words, "I cannot help you." Derek Walsh had already filed one story tonight and was working on a second that required information about the structure of the Bennett Family Trust and its historical relationship to Whitmore Global, and he had 3 sources telling him 3 different versions of the same essential story, which was the story of a woman who had saved her husband's company and then, 7 years later, watched him destroy it and removed him before he could take everyone else down with him. Derek Walsh had covered a lot of corporate stories. He had never covered one that felt like this. He left the building and stood on the sidewalk and called his editor. "The wife isn't just the wife," he said. "She's the reason the company survived the 2017 collapse. She's the controlling voice in the investment consortium. She wrote the clause that removed him." His editor was quiet for a moment. "Can you verify all of that?"
"I have 3 independent sources in the SEC filing on the Bennett Trust going back to 2017.
"The capital structure is all there if you know what you're looking at." He paused. "This is not a story about a man losing his company. This is a story about a woman who was invisible for 12 years and turned out to be the most important person in the room the entire time. His editor said, "Write it." By 9 o'clock, Victoria Laurent had called Richard's phone 14 times. He had let every call go to voicemail. At 9:17, she sent a text message that said, "Please call me. I need to know what is happening." At 9:41, she sent a second, "I heard about the board vote." "Richard, please." At 10:03, a third, "I'm scared. I don't know what this means for me." Richard read the messages and felt something he had not expected to feel, not tenderness and not protectiveness, but a kind of cold clarity that was perhaps the first genuinely clear thing he had felt in 2 years. Because reading those messages, he understood something about what Victoria Laurent had actually been to him, and it was not the thing he had told himself it was. He had told himself it was love. He had told himself it was the recognition of two people who genuinely understood each other. He had told himself a great many things in the particular late-night language of a man who is conducting an affair and requires a narrative that makes him the protagonist rather than the agent of someone else's pain. But reading those 3 messages, "I'm scared, I don't know what this means for me," he understood with sudden, unpleasant clarity that Victoria's concern in this moment was not for him. It was for herself, for the apartment, for the executive director title, for the salary and the travel budget and the position that had depended entirely on his ability to provide it. He did not reply. He set the phone down. And in the specific silence that followed, he sat with the understanding that the woman he had humiliated in front of 500 people was, and had always been, the only person in his life who had loved him independently of what he could provide. The morning that followed was, if anything, more difficult than the day before, because the previous day had at least carried the momentum of crisis, things happening quickly, decisions being made, the terrible clarity of active catastrophe. The morning after offered nothing but the detailed patient work of consequence. Richard's assistant called at 8 a.m. to inform him that his office had been cleared of personal items and that a box was being held at reception, that his access credentials had been formally suspended at midnight, that the interim CEO, a woman named Sandra Reeves, who had served as COO for the past 3 years and who Richard had hired and mentored, and who was by every available measure extremely competent, had already held her first executive team meeting at 7:30 that morning. Richard asked how the meeting had gone. His assistant hesitated. "From what I understand, sir, very well." He asked if anyone had asked about him. Another hesitation. The focus was primarily on operational continuity and the Southeast Asia timeline. He thanked her and hung up. Howard Greer arrived at 9. They sat in the study, and Howard laid out the legal landscape with the specific thoroughness of an attorney who knows that his client is not yet fully processing the information he is being given and will need to hear parts of it more than once. The personal liability exposure from the acquisition fund misappropriation was real but potentially manageable depending on how Richard chose to proceed. If he cooperated fully with the restructuring committee, repaid the $15 million in with interest, and accepted the board's findings without litigation, the company was unlikely to pursue criminal referral. If he fought it, if he contested the Section 14 vote, challenged the legitimacy of the process, engaged in the kind of prolonged legal battle that some men in his position chose out of a refusal to accept what had happened, the exposure increased significantly. "What would you do?" Richard said. Howard looked at him. "I would cooperate completely and immediately. I would repay the funds. I would accept the restructuring. And I would count myself fortunate that the people who removed me appeared to be motivated by protecting the company rather than by destroying me personally." Richard looked at his hands. "She could have destroyed me," he said. "She could have," Howard agreed. "She chose not to." "I'd remember that." At 11 a.m., Marcus Webb called Claire. She was at the offices of the Bennett Family Trust, sitting in the conference room that had become her primary workspace over the past 72 hours, surrounded by the transition documents that would guide the restructuring committee through the next 90 days. "The forensic team has completed the full audit," Marcus said. "The total figure of misdirected company funds, including all the ancillary expenses over 18 months, is $22.4 million. Claire absorbed this. "The necklace was 15, she said. "The apartment subsidiary structure, the travel expenses, and several other items bring it to 22.4. He paused. "The good news is that the company's underlying financials are strong. Sandra Reeves reviewed everything this morning and confirmed that the core business is healthy. The Southeast Asia option can still be salvaged if the fund is recapitalized within 9 days. And the recapitalization. We can advance it through the trust on the same terms as the 2017 arrangement, Marcus said, which means the company keeps the option, the deal moves forward, and 4,000 jobs remain entirely secure. Claire closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Do it, she said. Claire, Marcus said, and his voice had shifted slightly, carrying something that was not quite hesitation but was adjacent to it. I want to make sure you understand what you're doing. You are using your family's capital to fix a hole created by your husband's affair. For the second time, I know what I'm doing, she said. I'm protecting the company. Richard's personal conduct is separate from the company's obligations. A silence. You are a remarkable person, Marcus said. I'm a corporate attorney doing her job, Claire said. Same as always. But something in her voice, in the pause before those last 3 words, told Marcus Webb that the cost of doing this job, of being this precise and this capable and this consistent in the face of this specific kind of pain, was not something she was entirely finished paying. He did not say this. He had known Claire for 30 years, and he understood the particular way she held things that were too personal to discuss in professional settings, which was to say, she held them perfectly still and perfectly quiet, and then later, in private, she paid the full price. I'll initiate the advance, he said. Thank you, Marcus. She hung up. Eleanor Voss appeared in the conference room doorway at 11:45, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who has earned the right to ask a personal question and is deciding whether to use that right. She came in and set 1 cup in front of Claire and sat down across from her. How are you? Eleanor said. Functional, Claire said. That's not what I asked. Claire looked at her. Eleanor Voss was 61 years old and had spent 30 years in corporate governance and had seized 30s, approximately everything that power and money and human nature could produce when combined. She was one of the few people in Claire's world who did not need to be managed or protected from the truth. I'm sad, Claire said. I'm genuinely sad. Not about what happened at the board meeting that was necessary and I would do it again. I'm sad about what made it necessary. About the fact that a man I loved chose to become someone who required removing. Eleanor was quiet. Do you still love him, she said. A long pause. I love who he was when I married him, Claire said. I'm not sure that person still exists. Eleanor nodded slowly. What happens now between the 2 of you? We have practical matters to resolve, Claire said. The apartment, shared assets, legal arrangements. We are both professionals and we will handle it professionally. She paused. And then we will be people who used to know each other. Which is its own kind of grief, I suppose. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, but Eleanor Voss heard the weight beneath the matter-of-factness and recognized it as the weight of someone who had carried something alone for a very long time and had not yet put it down. For what it's worth, Eleanor said, what you did yesterday was one of the most precise and courageous things I have ever happened in a boardroom. And I have watched a lot of things happen in boardrooms. I wasn't trying to be courageous, Claire said. I was trying to be correct. I know, Eleanor said. That's what made it courageous. The Derek Walsh story ran at 2 p.m. and it ran with the headline, The Woman Who Built His Empire and Then Saved It From Him. The subheading read, How Claire Whitmore's hidden role in the 2017 rescue became the mechanism that ended Richard Whitmore's reign. The story was thorough, carefully sourced, and treated Claire not as a victim or as a villain, but as what she actually was, an exceptionally competent person who had operated in the invisible architecture of a powerful man's world and had, when required, made that architecture visible. Within 4 hours it had been shared 40,000 times. Within 6 hours 3 major outlets had run follow-up pieces. 2 focused on the corporate governance angle, 1 focused on the marriage. All 3 came to essentially the same conclusion. Worded differently but pointing in the same direction, the most powerful man in the room had spent 12 years underestimating the most important person in it. Victoria Laurent saw the stories at 3 p.m. She was sitting in the Upper East Side apartment, the apartment whose monthly expenses, she now understood, were processed through a shell company that was a Whitmore global subsidiary, and that would, in the course of the restructuring review, be unwound and its obligations terminated, and she was reading each story in sequence with the particular sick clarity of someone finally understanding a situation they had been inside without fully seeing. She had believed with the confidence of a woman who had been told many times that she was extraordinary, that Richard Whitmore loved her. She had believed that the apartment and the title, and the travel and the diamonds were expressions of that love evidence that she was worth providing for, worth protecting, worth showing to the world. Reading the Derek Walsh story, she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that Richard had funded her life with money that did not belong to him. She understood that the necklace she had worn 3 nights ago, the necklace that she had felt transformed her into something magnificent and publicly claimed, had been purchased with restricted capital that belonged to the shareholders of a public company. She understood that her title, her salary, her entire position within the Whitmore Foundation had been created not through her merit, but through the desire of a man who confused providing for people with loving them. And she understood, reading the quotes from Eleanor Voss and Marcus Webb and the careful, precise language of Patricia Chen's statements, that the woman she had thought of as a quiet, overlooked wife was in fact the reason the entire structure existed and the reason it had survived. She picked up the diamond necklace from her dressing table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she called her own attorney. "I need to return something," she said, "and I need to understand what my exposure is." Her attorney asked her to explain. She explained. There was a significant silence on the other end of the line. "Victoria," her attorney said very carefully, "how much did you know about where the funding for your position came from?" "I knew Richard paid for everything," she said. "I didn't ask questions about the source." "That's important," her attorney said. "Do not speak to anyone at Whitmore Global or the Foundation until we have spoken further. And the necklace, keep it secured. It will likely need to be returned as part of the asset recovery." Victoria set the necklace back on the dressing table. "Am I in legal trouble?" she said. "That depends on what we can establish about your knowledge," her attorney said. "If you genuinely did not know the funds were misappropriated, your exposure is limited. But we need to document that clearly and quickly." She sat in the apartment that was not really her apartment, wearing clothes purchased with money that had not really been Richard's to spend, surrounded by a life that had been built on a foundation she had not examined closely enough, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt foolish. Not in the small way that people feel foolish when they make minor errors, in the large foundational way that comes from understanding that a story you have been living was not the story you believed it was. Richard called her at 4:30. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Victoria," he said. "I want you to know that I'm going to make this right." She was quiet for a moment. "How?" she said. "I'm going to speak with my attorney and with the restructuring committee, and I'm going to—" "Richard," she said. He stopped. "The necklace," she said. "The apartment, the title, my salary," she paused. "Did you know, when you were giving me those things, that the money wasn't yours to give?" A long silence. "It's complicated," he said. "That's not an answer. The company's finances and my personal finances have always been." "Richard," her voice had gone very quiet. "Did you use company money to fund my life?" Another silence. "Some of it," he said. She closed her eyes. "I have to go," she said. "Victoria, I have to go," she said again. And she hung up. She sat in the quiet for a very long time. Then she called the Foundation's office and left a message for the interim director, Sandra Reeves, saying that she was placing herself on indefinite leave pending the outcome of the restructuring review, and that she was available to cooperate fully with the audit process. Then she took the diamond necklace and placed it carefully in its velvet box. She was not going to keep it. She understood now, actually owned it. At 6 p.m., Sandra Reeves held her second press conference of the day. She was composed and precise, and the first thing she said was, "The company is stable, our employees are protected, and our operational commitments remain fully intact." The second thing she said was, "We are grateful for the investor consortium's swift action in protecting the company's governance structure." The third thing she said, which was the thing that the assembled journalists wrote down most quickly, was, "Whitmore Global exists because it has people at every level who care about doing this correctly." Today was evidence of that. She did not name Claire. But 3 of the journalists in the room wrote Claire's name in their notebooks anyway, because they had read the Derek Walsh story, and they understood who Sandra Reeves was describing. Claire at that moment was not watching the press conference. She was on the phone with the head of the Southeast Asia acquisition team, walking through the recapitalization timeline, confirming that the 9-day window was achievable, asking the specific technical questions that needed to be answered before she could be satisfied that the deal was secure. She worked until 8, then she went home. Richard was not there. She didn't know where he had gone, and she found, sitting in the quiet apartment, that she did not have the energy tonight to feel anything about that beyond a kind of tired acknowledgement. The marriage was ending. It had probably been ending for longer than either of them had been willing to name. The formal steps, the attorneys, the asset division, the legal dissolution were still ahead, and they would require precisely the same competence and steadiness that everything else had required. She would manage it. She had always managed everything. But tonight, sitting alone in the apartment that had once held a life she believed in, Claire Whitmore allowed herself the one thing she had not permitted herself in the 3 days since she made the call to Marcus Webb. She sat with the grief. Not the anger, she had never been particularly angry, which was something she knew people found strange. But the grief was real, and it was large, and it deserved to be acknowledged rather than managed. She had loved him. She had rebuilt his company because she loved him and because it was right. She had drafted Section 14 because she was a professional who understood risk, and not because she foresaw betrayal. She had stayed in the marriage through 14 months of knowing about the affair because she had believed with conviction that the man she had married was still present somewhere inside, the man he had become. She understood now that she had been wrong about that. The man she had married would not have shoved her shoulder and walked away, would not have moved $15 million from a company fund without a second's hesitation, would not have stood in front of 500 people and adorned another woman with diamonds while his wife stood 3 feet away. That man was gone. Or perhaps he had never been entirely who she thought he was, and the years and the success and the particular corrupting effect of believing yourself untouchable had simply revealed the truth more completely. Either way, she was sitting alone in a quiet apartment. And somewhere in the city, 4,000 people were sleeping without knowing that the stability of their livelihoods had been, for the second time in 7 years, protected by a woman whose name would not appear in any official account of what had been done to protect them. Claire sat with that. It was not nothing. It was in fact quite a lot. And it was hers permanently. Irrevocably hers regardless of what happened next, regardless of what Richard understood or didn't understand, regardless of how the marriage ended or how the world eventually described what she had done. She had done it. It was enough. She got up, turned off the light, and went to bed. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, magnificent noise, and inside the architecture of Whitmore Global Holdings, Sandra Reeves was reviewing the next morning's agenda, and Marcus Webb was confirming the recapitalization advance, and the Southeast Asia acquisition was still alive, and 4,000 people slept without knowing how close it had come or who had held it together. And Richard Whitmore was sitting in a hotel room on the west side of Manhattan, holding his phone, scrolling through 12 years of photographs, looking at the face of a woman he had understood too late, feeling the specific, irreversible weight of a man who has finally completely run out of chances to choose differently. Richard Whitmore had not slept more than 3 hours in the 4 days since the gala. The hotel room on the west side of Manhattan had become a kind of holding cell not because anyone had put him there, but because he had nowhere else to be that made sense. The penthouse felt like a museum of someone else's life. Victoria's apartment was no longer an option. His office existed without him now, functioning with the particular indifferent efficiency of institutions that are larger than any one person, which was something Richard had always known intellectually and was now understanding in his body. He ordered coffee at 7 a.m. and sat with it and read the morning papers and found himself in all of them. Not on the front page belonged to a Senate vote and an earthquake in the Pacific, but in the business section, the culture section, the lifestyle column that one major outlet ran on Thursdays under the heading Power and its Discontents. In the lifestyle column, a writer named Margot Finch had written 800 words about the gala photograph, the one showing Richard's hands at Victoria's throat and Claire's face at the edge of the frame, and the piece was not about Richard at all. It was about Claire, about the specific quality of composure in that expression, about what it means to stand in the middle of your own humiliation and refuse to perform it for the people watching. Margot Finch had titled the piece, She Already Knew. Richard read it twice. He read it the second time, trying to find something to object to, and found nothing. Every observation was accurate. Every inference was correct. Margot Finch had never met Claire Whitmore and had nonetheless described her more precisely in 800 words than Richard had managed in 12 years of marriage. He set the paper down, his Howard Greer. "I need you in my office at 10, Howard said. "The restructuring committee has sent over preliminary terms for a settlement agreement, and we need to review them together before you respond to anything." "What kind of terms?" Richard said. "The kind that are considerably more generous than you deserve," Howard said flatly, "and that I would recommend you accept without negotiation." Richard arrived at Howard's office at 9:52. He had not shaved since the day of the board meeting, and he was wearing clothes he had purchased at a pharmacy 2 blocks from the hotel. Because the box of personal items from his office had been delivered to the penthouse, and he had not returned to the penthouse to retrieve it. He looked, in the precise language of someone observing him honestly, like a man who was not taking care of himself. Howard noticed but said nothing about it, because there were more pressing matters. The settlement terms were laid out in a 40-page document that Howard had already read twice and annotated carefully. He walked Richard through the key provisions with the patience of someone who understands that the person across the table is absorbing information at roughly 40% capacity and needs to hear the important parts more than once. The company was not pursuing criminal referral for the misappropriation. This was a deliberate choice by the restructuring committee, made on the grounds that a criminal proceeding would create publicity damaging to the company's reputation and distressing to its employees, and that full financial restitution achieved the same corrective outcome without those costs. Richard was required to repay the full $22.4 million, the amount the forensic audit had established as the total of misdirected funds within 60 days, with interest calculated at the rate of the original investor agreement. His equity stake in Whitmore Global was not being touched. He retained his shares. He would continue to receive dividends. He was not being destroyed financially. He was being removed operationally, which was a meaningful distinction, and one that Howard wanted him to understand clearly. He was required to resign formally as a board member and as a director of all Whitmore subsidiaries. He was prohibited from any operational involvement with the company for a period of 3 years. After 3 years, the board retained the right to reconsider his involvement based on demonstrated conduct. There was one additional provision that was not financial. Richard stopped at that page. "What is this?" he said. Howard looked at the page. "The committee is requiring a formal public acknowledgement issued under Richard's name, stating that the governance review was conducted properly, that the board's findings were accurate, and that the restructuring was in the best interests of the company and its employees. They want me to sign a statement saying they were right." "They want you to sign a statement saying they were right," Howard confirmed. "Because they were. And because the employees of this company have been reading stories for 4 days about whether their jobs are secure, and a statement from you acknowledging the situation directly and confirming that the company's leadership acted correctly will do more to stabilize employee morale than any press release from Sandra Reeves." Richard looked at the provision for a long time. "She asked for this," he said. "Claire asked for this." Howard didn't answer immediately. "The provision protects the employees," he said carefully. "Whoever suggested it, that's what it does." Richard set the document down. He pressed both hands flat against Howard's conference table and stared at the wood grain for a moment and then looked up. "She's still protecting them," he said, "even now. She's still thinking about 4,000 people she's never met." "Yes," Howard said simply. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room. When a man finds like fully understands something he should have understood years earlier. It was not comfortable. It was not cleansing. It was simply the weight of accurate information settling into the place where a misunderstanding used to live. "I'll sign it," Richard said. "All of it today," Howard nodded. "I'll contact the committee." At 11:15 a.m., as Howard was drafting the response to the restructuring committee, Richard's phone showed an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. Then something instinct or the particular susceptibility of a man with nothing left to protect made him answer. "Mr. Whitmore," a woman's voice, professional, measured. "My name is Celia Grant. I'm a senior producer at the Chronicle Network. I'm calling because we're preparing a documentary segment on the events at Whitmore Global this week, and we'd like to offer you the opportunity to speak on your own behalf." Richard was quiet. "We've already spoken with several board members," Celia Grant continued, "and we have confirmation that Mrs. Whitmore's team has agreed to a brief on-record comment. We thought it would be in your interest to—" "No," Richard said. A pause. "Mr. Whitmore, without your perspective, the story will be told entirely." "I know," he said. "That's appropriate." Another pause. Longer. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain," he said. And he hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about what he had just done and found. to his slight precise, that it felt like the first genuinely clean decision he had made in a very long time. There was no story he could tell in that documentary that would be more truthful than silence. There was no version of his perspective that added something valuable to the accurate account that already existed. He had done what he had done, the documentation was complete. The record was correct. Adding his voice to it would only be another performance, and he was exhausted, finally and completely, by performance. What he did instead at 12:30 p.m. was call a number he had not called in 7 years. It rang 3 times, Richard. The voice was careful. Not warm, not cold, Claire, he said. I signed the settlement. All of it. Howard is sending the response now, I heard. She said. Thank you. I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without responding until I'm finished. A brief pause. All right. I spent 12 years watching you be extraordinary and telling myself it was ordinary, he said. I watched you save my company, and I convinced myself it was luck, or circumstance, or something that had more to do with me than with you. I promoted a woman who made me feel powerful because I'd stopped being able to feel that with someone who could see through me. I moved money from a fund that 4,000 people depended on to buy jewelry to prove something to myself. He stopped. I don't have an explanation that makes any of that acceptable. I just need you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the financial piece. The whole thing. I understand what I did to you. The silence on the line was long. Richard, she said finally. I believe you understand it. I do, a pause. But understanding it now doesn't change what it was. And I think you know that, I know that, he said. Then what do you need from me? He thought about that. It was the most honest question anyone had asked him in weeks. And the most honest answer was also the most difficult one to say out loud. I don't need anything from you, he said. I just needed you to know that I know. That's all. Another silence. I appreciate that, Claire said. And her voice, for the first time in days, had something human in it that was not professional or strategic, or composed something that was simply tired and sad and true. Take care of yourself, Richard. Whatever happens next, take care of yourself. She hung up. Richard sat alone with his phone in a borrowed conference room in his attorney's office and felt the full weight of everything he had built and everything he had lost and the specific distance between those two things, which was, he understood now, a distance entirely of his own making. At 2 p.m., Sandra Reeves held a company-wide meeting that was conducted simultaneously across all Whitmore global offices via video conference. She spoke to 4,000 people directly, which was something Richard had never done. His communications to the company at large had always gone through department heads, filtered down through the organizational layers, arriving at the people who actually built the company, already translated by the time it reached them. Sandra Reeves looked directly into the camera and spoke to 4,000 people as if each of them were the only person watching. I want to be honest with you, she said. This week was difficult. The news was unexpected. You deserved a leadership that prioritized your security above everything else. Instead, you spent 4 days reading stories about a crisis that should never have come close to your livelihoods. She paused. I want you to know that the people who caught this problem did so specifically because they were thinking about you, about what you've built, about what you deserve. Another pause. That doesn't undo the disruption, but I want you to know that your work matters. This company is healthier than it was 4 days ago because the right people did the right thing at the right time. And your jobs, all of them, are secure. The response to that meeting, measured in the informal currency of company communications, the emails to HR, the messages in internal channels, the conversations that managers reported upward, was something that Sandra Reeves would describe later as the most clear signal she had received in her career that a company's people were its actual asset. Thousands of responses, many of them brief, most of them some version of the same thing. Thank you for telling us directly. Eleanor Voss called Claire at 3:15. Did you watch Sandra's company meeting? Eleanor said. Yes, Claire said. She's going to be exceptional, Eleanor said. You hired well. Richard hired her, Claire said. Richard hired her resume, Eleanor said. You advocated for her for the CO position 3 years ago over 2 other candidates who were technically more qualified on paper. I was in that board conversation, Claire, I remember. A brief silence. She was the right choice then, and she's the right choice now, Claire said. I know, Eleanor said. That's my point. By 4 p.m., the story had reached a dimension that none of the people involved had entirely anticipated, though perhaps they should have. The Derek Walsh piece had generated its own wave of follow-on coverage, and that wave had merged with the gala photographs and the board vote news and the restructuring announcement to produce something that was, in the specific way of media moments that capture something true about how people actually live, resonant far beyond the business community. The story was being discussed by people who had no investment in Whitmore Global. It was being shared by women who worked in offices and recognized something specific in the image of Claire, standing at the edge of the frame, the position of being essential and invisible, of doing the work that holds something together while being the last person credited for it. It was being discussed by men, some of them honestly, about the particular self-deception of believing that the success around you is entirely your own construction. It was being shared in group messages and email threads and the kind of conversations that happen between people who know each other well enough to use specific language rather than polite approximations. Claire did not read most of it. She did not have time, and she did not have the emotional bandwidth, and she had learned long ago that the way other people describe your life is almost never accurate enough to be worth the energy required to engage with it. She knew what she had done. She knew why she had done it. The media's interpretation of those facts was interesting but not essential. What was essential at 4:30 p.m. on the fourth day after the gala was a call she had been waiting for all week. It came from James Whitfield, the lead partner of the Southeast Asia acquisition, Target, a Singapore-based logistic consortium that had been in advanced negotiations with Whitmore Global for 8 months. James Whitfield was 67 years old, deeply traditional in his business culture, and had spent the past 4 days watching the American news coverage with the specific concern of a man whose company's proposed partnership had just become a headline for reasons entirely unrelated to logistics. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Whitfield," Claire said. "Thank you for calling. I will be direct with you, because I believe you prefer that." "I do," she said. "My board is concerned," he said. "The situation at Whitmore Global this week has raised questions about organizational stability. We have put significant time and resources into this negotiation, and before my board commits to finalizing, they require assurance that the company's leadership structure is sound." "I understand completely," Claire said. "Can you provide that assurance?" "I can," she said. "Sandra Reeves has been CEO for 3 years and has an operational record that any board would be confident in. The company's core financials are strong. I can have our CFO send you the audited figures within the hour. The acquisition fund has been fully recapitalized and the capital is verified and available. The instability you observed this week was the result of removing a problem, not creating one. The company that will partner with your consortium is healthier today than it was a week ago." A silence on the line. "Mrs. Whitmore," James Whitfield said carefully, "I have spent 40 years in international business. I have encountered many governance crises. Most of them are resolved messily. This one was resolved." He paused, choosing his word. "Surgically. We tried," Claire said. "Who is we?" he said. A brief pause. "The people who care about this company," she said. Another silence, longer. "I would like to arrange a call between my board and Mrs. Reeves for tomorrow morning," he said. "If that can be arranged." "It can be arranged," Claire said. "I'll have Sandra's assistant contact you within the hour." "Thank you," he said. He paused before hanging up in the particular way of someone who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. "For what it's worth," James Whitfield said, "in my experience, the people who hold things together are rarely the ones who receive credit for it. I hope that changes." Claire held the phone after he hung up. She sat with that for a moment, then she called Sandra Reeves. "James Whitfield's office will contact you within the hour to schedule a call with his board for tomorrow morning," she said. "The deal is still alive." Sandra was quiet for exactly 1 second, which was the Sandra Reeves version of a visible emotional reaction. "Claire," she said. "How?" "I told him the truth," Claire said. "That this company is better today than it was a week ago." "Because it is." "Because of you," Sandra said. "Because of the right structure," Claire said, "which is what holds everything up when individual people fail. That's why structures matter. That's why I built one." She could hear Sandra absorbing this. "Can I ask you something?" Sandra said. "Of course. Did you know? When you drafted the investor agreement 7 years ago, did you know that you might need it someday?" The question that Howard had asked, that Marcus had implied, that everyone eventually seemed to arrive at. Claire thought about the answer carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I knew that power shifts," she said. "I knew that good intentions erode. I knew that a person who never faces consequences for anything eventually stops believing consequences exist." So I built something that could hold even when the person at the top stopped holding. She paused. I didn't know I'd need it, but I knew someone might. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I want to be the kind of leader who doesn't need it, she said. Then you already are, Claire said. The ones who need it are never the ones who worry about needing it. She hung up. At 6 p.m., Richard signed the formal settlement documents at Howard's office. He signed each page without reading them again. He had read them. He understood them. The rereading was simply delay, and when he reached the public acknowledgement provision, he held his pen over the signature line for exactly 3 seconds. Then he signed. Howard witnessed the signatures and notarized the relevant pages and said nothing beyond what was procedurally required, because Howard Greer had been practicing law for 30 years, and he understood that some moments belong entirely to the person inside them and have no need of commentary. Richard stood up when it was done. He shook Howard's hand. "What now?" he said. Howard considered the question seriously, the way a good attorney considers questions that are only partly legal. "Now you figure out who you are when you're not Richard Whitmore, CEO, Howard said, which is something most people in your position never get the opportunity to do, and either the best thing that ever happened to you or the worst, depending on what you do with it." Richard put on his jacket. "Thank you, Howard," he said, "for everything, including the things I didn't want to hear." "Those are always the most important ones," Howard said. Richard left. He stood on the sidewalk outside Howard's building, and for the first time in 4 days he had no phone calls scheduled, no documents to review, no press to avoid, no crisis to manage. The afternoon had gone to evening, and the city was doing what cities do. In the early evening, the particular shift in noise and pace, and the quality of light that means the working day is ending and the rest of life is beginning. He thought about the statement he had signed, the public acknowledgement that Claire had required not as revenge, he understood now, but as a final protective act for the 4,000 people whose morale depended on clarity. He thought about signing it and felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt relieved because it was true. And there is a specific quiet relief in finally saying a true thing out loud after a long time of saying other things. He started walking. He had no destination. He simply walked, because walking was the one thing he could do that required nothing of him except moving forward, and forward was the only direction that existed. He walked for 40 minutes before he realized he had walked to a neighborhood. He recognized the Upper Sesaktad, 3 blocks from the apartment building where he and Claire had lived for the first 2 years of their marriage, before the company's success had moved them to the penthouse. The building was still there. It looked smaller than he remembered, which was probably just the 12 years of accumulated comparison rather than any actual change in the structure. He stood across the street from it and thought about the person he had been in that apartment. The person who had asked Claire's opinion on every major decision and had meant it. The person who had found her intelligence genuinely exciting rather than subtly threatening. The person who had told her, on their 2nd anniversary, that being married to her made him better at everything, and had been telling the truth. He thought about what had happened to that person. He thought about the specific process by which success, when it comes fast and large and is not examined carefully, can hollow out the qualities that generated it. How the confidence that gets you to the top can curdle, if you're not watchful, into the arrogance that ends you. How the people who challenge you, the ones who push back, who see through you, who hold you accountable with love, can start to feel threatening rather than steadying. And how the people who simply reflect your best self back at you can feel like a relief, even when what they're actually doing is removing the friction that keeps you honest. Victoria had removed the friction. Claire had been the friction. And he had chosen repeatedly and deliberately, and with full awareness that he was making a choice, the comfort of the mirror over the difficulty of the truth. He had chosen it until the truth became unavoidable. He turned away from the building and kept walking. At 8:15 p.m., Diane Marsh called Claire. She'd been calling every evening since the gala, the calls getting longer and the professional distance in Claire's voice getting slightly shorter each time, which was Diane's way of understanding that her friend would gradually, in increments, coming down from the sustained intensity of the past week. "The Whitfield call is confirmed for tomorrow," Claire said, which was not what Diane had called to discuss, but which she understood was Claire's way of imagining approached the conversation Diane actually wanted to have. "Good," Diane said, "and how are you?" "I signed the divorce papers today," Claire said. A silence. "Claire, I'm okay," Claire said. "I want you to know that." I'm genuinely okay, not performing, actually okay. Tell me the difference, Diane said. Performing okay is what I was doing at the gala, Claire said. Standing there with my champagne and my composure and my sense that I knew exactly what was happening and exactly what to do about it. That was performance. Very good performance, but performance, she paused. Actually okay is what this is. Sitting alone in a quiet apartment, having signed divorce papers, having handled a week that would have broken most people, and feeling not happy, not relieved exactly, but settled, like something that was wrong has been corrected, like the structure finally matches the reality. Diane was quiet for a moment. You know what I think, she said. Tell me. I think you've been actually okay for a long time, Diane said. I think you were okay, even when you were in it. I think you're one of those people who orients toward what's true rather than what's comfortable, and that means you process things in real time instead of after the fact. You didn't fall apart after the gala because you'd already done the falling apart, alone, over the 14 months before it, in the privacy of knowing what you knew and deciding what to do about it. Claire was quiet, she said. Not maybe, Diane said. I've known you for 22 years. I know how you grieve. You do it quietly and then you're done. I'm not entirely done, Claire admitted. No, Diane said, but you're close. And when you're done, you're going to be extraordinary. You already are. You've always been, Claire laughed. It was a small laugh, slightly surprised, the laugh of someone who did not expect to laugh tonight and found it more welcome for the unexpectedness. Come visit, Claire said. Next weekend. We'll do absolutely nothing productive and I'll make you that terrible pasta I always make and you'll pretend it's good. Your pasta is genuinely terrible, Diane said. I'll be there Saturday. After they hung up, Claire sat in the quiet for a long time. The apartment that had felt like a museum 2 nights ago felt different tonight, not warm exactly, not full, but hers. Completely, unambiguously hers. There was a quality of rightness in that, even in the absence of comfort, that she recognized as the specific feeling of a life that has been realigned to something true. She thought about the morning she had called Marcus Webb and said, activate the agreement, and she thought about the board meeting, and the settlement terms, and the Whitfield call, and the 4,000 people who would go to work tomorrow in a company that was still standing, because enough of the right people had done enough of the right things at enough of the right moments. She thought about Richard signing documents in Howard's office. She did not know where he was tonight. She did not need to know. He was no longer her responsibility, not his well-being, not his decisions, not the stories he would need to tell himself in order to rebuild whatever came next for him. She wished him well in the specific way that you can wish someone well, while also understanding completely that their well-being is no longer something you are arranged around. That was new. That newness had its own particular quality, not freedom exactly, not yet, but the first suggestion of what freedom might feel like when it arrived. She got up and went to her desk and opened her laptop and worked for an hour on the restructuring committee's timeline, and the work was satisfying in the way that precise and necessary work is always satisfying. And when she finally closed the laptop and turned off the light, she felt the specific tiredness of someone who has done something real. Outside, the city continued its permanent indifferent noise. And inside that noise, in the particular silence of the apartment, Claire Whitmore slept without dreaming, rested, settled, and more entirely herself than she had been in a very long time. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in November, 11 weeks after the gala. Claire signed the last document at 9:17 a.m. in Patricia Chen's office, Mark was as witness and Diane Marsh sitting 2 chairs away, present not in any professional capacity, but simply because she had driven down from Philadelphia the night before and told Claire she was not doing this alone. The signing itself took less than 4 minutes. 12 years of marriage reduced, in the formal language of legal dissolution, to signatures on 11 pages and the transfer of specific assets according to a settlement agreement that both parties had negotiated without a single courtroom appearance. Richard had been cooperative throughout the entire process. Not performatively cooperative, not the kind of cooperation that announces itself and acknowledgement, but genuinely, quietly cooperative, in the way of a man who has understood something irreversible and has decided that the only remaining dignity available to him is in how he moves through the consequences. He had not contested a single term, he had not delayed. He had not used the process as an opportunity to relitigate anything that had already been decided. He had simply signed what was put in front of him and returned it promptly and left Claire to move forward without the additional weight of a prolonged legal battle. She had noted this, because did not change anything that had happened, but she noted it because she was someone who noticed things accurately and gave credit where it existed regardless of whether the person receiving the credit deserved her warmth. When the last signature was witnessed and the documents were collected, and the formal part of the morning was complete, Diane put her arm around Claire's shoulders and said nothing, which was the exact right thing to do. Patricia Chen offered coffee. Marcus Webb, who was 63 years old and had known Claire since she was 12, and had watched navigate more difficult things than most people encountered in several lifetimes, looked at her across the conference table with an expression that contained everything he wanted to say and said none of it, because he understood that she would find words insufficient this morning and presence sufficient. "Thank you," Claire said, to all of them, and then she picked up her bag and walked out. She and Diane went to a diner 3 blocks away and ordered eggs and coffee and sat in a corner booth and talked for 2 hours about everything except what had just happened, which was exactly what Claire needed, the specific relief of being treated as a complete person rather than a person defined by a crisis. They talked about Diane's daughter, who was applying to law schools. They talked about a novel they had both read the previous month. They talked about a trip they had been planning for 3 years and never taken, to Portugal, and they set a date the following April, and Diane wrote it in her phone calendar, while Claire watched and felt something she recognized as the specific warmth of a future that was beginning to take shape. She went back to work at noon, because that was who Claire Whitmore was. She processed things fully and then she moved. The restructuring of Whitmore Global had proceeded with the kind of quiet efficiency that Sansa Reeves brought to everything she touched. The Southeast Asia deal had closed 10 days after the Whitfield call, right at the edge of the acquisition window, with 48 hours to spare, and the announcement of the Singapore Logistics Partnership had moved the company's stock 4 points upward in a single trading session. 4,000 people had gone to work the morning after that announcement with the particular energy of people who have been through a scare and come out the other side and feel, now, the specific relief of stability confirmed. Sandra had called Claire after the close. 4 points, Sandra said. "I saw," Claire said. "The analysts are attributing it to the leadership transition," Sandra said. Several of them specifically cited the board's decisive governance response as a confidence signal. "Good," Claire said. "That's accurate, Claire." Sandra paused. "I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead." "The restructuring committee meets next month to review interim leadership status," Sandra said. "There's a conversation happening at the board level about whether the interim designation should be made permanent. I want to know, and I'm asking you specifically, because you are the person whose opinion I trust most on this. Do you think I'm ready?" The question was asked with the specific mixture of confidence and genuine uncertainty that characterizes people who are actually competent, the ones who know what they know, and also know clearly what they don't know, and are not afraid to name the boundary between them. "Yes," Claire said, without qualification. A pause. "Can I ask why you're so certain?" Sandra said. "Because you just asked me that question," Claire said. "The person who isn't ready never asks. They either assume they're ready or they're too afraid to ask because they already know the answer is no. You asked because you wanted an honest assessment and were prepared to hear either answer. That's exactly the kind of person this company needs at the top." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I learned that from watching you," she said. "Then use it well," Claire said. "That's the only credit I need." The board made Sandra's appointment permanent at the November committee meeting. Richard, who retained his shares and received the announcement the same way all shareholders received it through a formal company notification, sent Sandra a brief, handwritten note of congratulations. Sandra told Claire about it 2 days later, not because she thought Claire needed to know, but because she thought Claire deserved to. He said, "You are exactly what this company needs. I should have listened better when people who saw clearly tried to tell me that," Sandra reported. Claire received that. "He's learning," she said. "Is that enough?" Sandra asked. "For him," Claire said, "I hope so. For me, that question stopped being relevant 11 weeks ago." By December, the diamond necklace had been returned to the company's possession through the asset recovery process and sold at private auction. The proceeds, slightly under the original $15 million, accounting for market fluctuation, were deposited back into the Southeast Asia Acquisition Fund, which technically no longer needed them since the deal was closed, and so the board voted to redirect the funds to the Whitmore Foundation's Medical Initiative Program, which had been underfunded for 3 consecutive years. Claire was not on the board. She had no formal role in that vote. but Eleanor Voss called her afterward. "The necklace money," Eleanor said. "You know where it went," I heard Claire said. "Were you involved in that recommendation?" I mentioned to Marcus, in passing, that the medical initiative had been underfunded for 3 years. Claire said, "I don't know if that had any bearing on the board's discussion." Eleanor laughed a real laugh, the laugh of someone who has been around long enough to know exactly how these things work. "You are incorrigible," Eleanor said. "I prefer thorough," Claire said. It was the first time she had laughed about any of it. She noticed that. She thought it meant something, not that the grief was finished. Because grief of that particular kind, the grief of a marriage and a version of yourself that no longer exists, doesn't finish cleanly. It attenuates, it becomes familiar. It stops defining the shape of every morning and starts being something you carry rather than something that carries you. She was somewhere in that transition, and the laugh with Eleanor was a marker, a small but real signal that she was moving, that the weight had shifted enough to allow something lighter in. January came, and with January came something Claire had not anticipated. She received a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, on plain paper, delivered through her attorney's office from a woman named Ruth Cardenas, who worked in the accounts payable department of Whitmore Global's shipping division. Ruth Cardenas had been with the company for 17 years. She had a husband who drove a city bus and 2 kids in middle school, and a mortgage on a house in Queens that she had been paying down for 9 years. The letter was 2 pages long and handwritten in a careful, deliberate script that suggested Ruth Cardenas had written several drafts before settling on this one. It said, "I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't know if it's appropriate to send, but I have been trying to find a way to say this since November, and I have not been able to say it any other way. I found out from reading the news that the reason my job still exists, the reason I could still pay my mortgage and take my kids to school and sit at my desk every morning is because of what you did. Not just last fall, 7 years ago, and again last fall. I don't know you. I have never met you. You did this for people you have never met. I wanted you to know that one of those people knows. And that it matters. It matters every single day." Claire read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote back. She wrote a full page, longhand, and she said, "Your letter reached me. Thank you for sending it. The work you do every day, showing up, building something, taking care of your family, that's what made it worth protecting. I didn't do it for abstraction. I did it for people exactly like you. I'm glad you wrote." She mailed it the same afternoon. She told no one about the exchange, but she kept Ruth Cardenas' letter in her desk drawer, and on the days when the magnitude of what she had done and what she had lost seemed to tilt toward the loss, she took it out and read it again. It always rebalanced her. February brought the first public event Claire attended alone, a foundation dinner for a medical research consortium she had quietly joined as an advisory board member in January. It was the first step in a set of professional moves she had been planning since November, each one deliberate. Each one chosen for what it actually was, rather than for how it looked or what it signaled about her position in the world. She was not rebuilding in reaction to anything. She was building toward something specific. The evening went well. She knew several people in the room. She was introduced by the Foundation's executive director as an exceptionally gifted strategic advisor and one of the most important voices in governance reform in this country right now, which was a characterization she found both flattering and slightly overconstructed, but she accepted it gracefully because the work was real and the recognition, for once, was attached to something she had done in her own name. A man named Daniel Park introduced himself during the reception. He was a physician-turned-administrator who ran a hospital network in the Northeast, and who had been working for 3 years on a capital initiative to expand pediatric services in underserved communities. He had read about her in December, the Derek Walsh story, then the follow-up pieces, then a longer profile in a legal journal that had examined the governance architecture of the Whitmore rescue, and he had been waiting for an opportunity to speak with her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," Claire said. "The investor agreement you built in 2017, the protective clauses, the structure that held even when the person at the top failed." He paused. "Is that something you could apply to a nonprofit capital structure? We have a situation where we're preparing for a significant capital raise, and our governance framework is, to be honest, not built to handle the scale we're moving toward." Claire looked at him. "Tell me more," she said. They talked for 40 minutes. well past the point where the reception had moved to dinner, and 2 Foundation staff members had come to find Daniel Park and told him the dinner was starting, and he had thanked them and kept talking to Claire. By the end of the conversation, Claire had agreed to a formal consultation. She had 3 conditions: that the engagement was structured as a project with defined scope and outcomes, that her recommendations would be implemented in full, or the engagement would end, and that the Hospital Networks Board would participate directly in the governance review, rather than receiving the findings secondhand. Daniel Park agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation. "Can I ask one more thing?" he said. "Of course. Why are you doing this? You don't need to take on new work right now. You've just been through, by any measure, a significant period. Why take on something this complex?" Claire thought about the question. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Because this is who I am," she said. "Not who I became after everything that happened. Who I was before Richard, before the marriage, before any of it. I'm a person who builds structures that protect things. That's not a response to what happened to me, it's simply what I do." She paused. "I got somewhat lost inside someone else's story for a while. I'm telling my own story again now. This is what my story looks like." Daniel Park nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad you're telling it," he said. She went home that evening, feeling something she had been working toward for 3 months without quite being able to name it, and which she now recognized as direction. Not urgency, not momentum, but the specific, settled clarity of a person who knows where she is going and has begun going there. March arrived. Richard called on a Thursday afternoon, which was the first time he had called her personal number since the morning after the board meeting. The divorce had been handled entirely through attorneys, the property settlement efficiently, and they had not spoken directly since that kitchen conversation 4 days after the gala. She almost didn't answer. She answered Claire. His voice was different than it had been in November. Less compressed, as if something had been released from it. "Richard," she said. "I want you to know I'm getting help," he said. "A therapist, 3 times a week. I've been going since December." She received this, "I'm glad," she said, and she meant it. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "about all of it. The company, you, the person I was 10 years ago versus the person I became. I don't have anything to ask you. I'm not calling to ask anything. I wanted you to know that I'm working on understanding it. Not to get anything back, just because it's the right thing to do." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That's good, Richard," she said. "That's genuinely good. Are you okay?" he said. "I'm better than okay," she said. "I'm working on something I care about, and I'm going to Portugal in April, and I'm eating dinner with actual friends again instead of industry contacts." She paused. "I'm good," a silence. "I'm glad," he said. And his voice carried the specific quality of a man who is telling the truth, even though the truth is difficult, meaning that her happiness, at this distance, from this particular side of what they had been to each other, was something he could receive and wish for genuinely without needing it to have anything to do with him. That was growth. She recognized it. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he said. He hung up. She stood with the phone for a moment and felt the specific lightness of something completely finished. Not forgotten, not erased, simply finished. Placed in its proper position in the architecture of her life, not at the center, not defining everything around it, but in its accurate place, as a chapter that had ended and that contained, alongside everything terrible in it, things that had also been real and worth having. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. In April, Claire flew to Lisbon with Diane. They spent 10 days doing exactly what they had said they would do: nothing productive, nothing strategic, nothing that required the particular quality of sustained professional competence that Claire had been deploying continuously for the better part of a year. They walked, they ate late. They sat in small restaurants and drank wine that was good but not expensive, which was a choice that Claire made deliberately and that Diane understood completely. They visited a gallery on their 4th day and stood in front of a painting for 20 minutes without talking, which was the kind of thing you can only do with someone you have known for 22 years. On their 7th evening, sitting at a small table in a restaurant near the water, Diane looked at her friend across the remains of dinner and said, "You look like yourself again." Claire considered this. "I think I look more like myself than I have in a long time," she said. "Maybe since before the marriage." "Not entirely," Diane said. "You're different, you're more." "More what?" "More settled," Diane said. "Like you've stopped waiting for something. Like you're not arranging yourself around an absence anymore." Claire was quiet. "I read a quote once," she said. I don't remember who said it. It said that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is spend so long making herself smaller that she forgets the size of the space she actually occupies. She picked up her wine glass. I was doing that. I didn't know I was doing it until I stopped. Diane raised her glass. To the size of the space you actually occupy, she said. Claire raised hers. To the size of the space, she said. They drank. The night Claire returned from Lisbon, there was an email from Daniel Park's executive assistant confirming the hospital network's board had approved the governance consultation on all 3 of Claire's terms. The project would begin the following Monday. The budget was approved. The timeline was 12 weeks, she replied, confirmed. I'll see you Monday. She closed her laptop. She sat in the quiet of her apartment, hers entirely, rearranged over the past 4 months into a space that reflected her choices rather than the compromises of a shared life. And she thought about everything that had happened in the 11 months since the gala. She thought about it not with regret or with triumph, but with the specific, accurate attention she brought to every significant thing in her life. She thought about standing in that ballroom with champagne dripping from her dress and a smile on her face that the entire world had subsequently tried to interpret. And she thought about how none of the interpretations had been quite right, because the truth was simpler and less dramatic than any of the narratives that had been built around it. The truth was that she had not been performing composure. She had not been secretly triumphant. She had not been building toward a moment of revenge. She had simply been herself, the person she had always been, underneath the architecture of someone else's story. And when Richard had crossed the line from personal failing to genuine harm, she had done what she had always done. She had built the structure that protected the thing worth protecting. The company had survived. 4,000 people still had jobs. Sandra Reeves was excellent. The Singapore partnership was performing above projections. The Medical Foundation's endowment had grown by 11% in the first quarter, partly due to the redirected auction funds. The governance framework that Claire had drafted 7 years ago had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had held when the person at the top had failed to hold himself. And Claire Whitmore was sitting in her own apartment, healthy and clear-eyed and oriented toward a future that was hers to build however she chose. She thought about Ruth Cardenas, who came to work every morning in Queens and paid her mortgage, and did not know the name of the woman who had made that possible and did not need to. She thought about the 4,000 others like her, the ones who had gone through those 4 days in October not knowing whether their stability was intact and had come out the other side because enough of the right things had been built by, enough of the right people at enough of the right times. She thought about what real power actually was. Not the power Richard had exercised, the power to command, to consume, to be seen, to take up space loudly and force others to arrange themselves around you. That power was real, but it was brittle. It depended on continuous performance. It required constant maintenance. It could be revoked by a board vote in a single morning. Real power was different. Real power was the ability to build something that held even when you were not in the room. Something that worked because the structure was sound, not because the person at the top was present. Something that protected people who would never know your name. Something that remained permanent, functional, genuinely useful long after the headlines had moved on and the crisis had resolved and the world had found something else to discuss. Claire had built that. 7 years ago, in 4 months of quiet, invisible work, she had built a structure that saved 4,000 jobs twice. She had written a clause in an agreement that no one read carefully, and that clause had, when required, done exactly what it was designed to do. She had protected people she had never met, using skills she had developed before anyone knew her name, and she had done it without recognition, without credit, without anyone in the room understanding what they were witnessing. And now they understood, not all of them, not perfectly. The media's version of the story would continue to simplify and occasionally distort as it always did. The full complexity of what she had done and why she had done it would remain in its accurate form, knowable only to the small number of people who had been present for the real version. But she knew that was always the thing that had mattered most to her. Not the audience, not the credit, not the acknowledgement. Simply the knowledge that she had done the right thing correctly, that the structure she had built was sound, that the people who needed protecting were protected. She had done that. And no one, not Richard, not the board, not the passage of time, Not the gradual erosion of public interest in this particular story could take that from her. It was hers. Completely and permanently hers. She got up and turned off the light. Tomorrow she would begin again, new work, new structure, new people to protect and problems to solve, and frameworks to build that would hold long after anyone had stopped watching. That was what she did. That was in the most fundamental sense who she was. The wife they had all underestimated had never needed anyone to understand her power. She had simply needed the moment to use it. And when that moment came, she had been ready because she had been ready her entire life. That was her story. That had always been her story. And it was only just beginning.